In 1978, a man broke into a home in California. He terrorized the couple inside for hours. He left behind chaos, trauma, and devastation. But he also left behind something else, ... Something he didn't know he had. For 40 years, that tiny biological sample sat in a police evidence locker. It was a silent witness waiting for the future to arrive. The killer thought he had committed the perfect crimes. He thought he had outsmarted the police. But he forgot one thing. You can hide your face. You can change your name. But you cannot hide from your own DNA. Imagine it is 2 a.m. The phone rings. You pick it up, expecting an emergency. Instead, you hear a heavy, ragged breath. And then, a whisper. This is the voice of the Golden State Killer. For 12 years, he was a phantom who raped, tortured, and murdered his way across California. He had 50 victims. He had no face. And until 2018, he was the greatest unsolved mystery in American criminal history. On a sunny Tuesday in April 2018, an old man was standing in his driveway in Citrus Heights, California. He was a retired mechanic, a grandfather. He was working on his boat. He looked like the most boring man in America. But when the police surrounded him, they didn't see a grandfather. They saw a monster. They saw the man who had haunted their nightmares for 4 decades. The neighbors thought he was just Joe. The FBI knew him as the Golden State Killer. And his roast was still in the oven. For 12 years, a single man held the entire state of California hostage. He was a phantom who could slip into homes, terrorize families for hours, and vanish without a trace. He didn't have a name. He had a dozen nicknames. Police in the north called him the East Area Rapist. Police in the south called him the original Night Stalker. For decades, they didn't even know they were hunting the same man. He left behind a staggering trail of devastation. 30 murders, over 50 rapes, and more than 120 burglaries. Traditional police work failed. Fingerprints failed. Witnesses failed. The case went ice cold. Welcome to Hidden Killers. Today, we are looking at the most significant breakthrough in the history of forensic science. We are going to tell the story of how a retired detective and a genetic genealogist used a public DNA website to hunt a ghost. They didn't find him by looking for a criminal. They found him by looking for his third cousins. This is the story of the hunt for the Golden State Killer. To understand the magnitude of the manhunt, you have to understand the scale of the terror. For 12 years, from 1974 to 1986, a single man held the state of California in a grip of fear that is hard to imagine today. He was a phantom. He didn't just commit crimes. He waged a campaign of psychological warfare. In Sacramento, he was known as the East Area Rapist. He would break into homes, wake couples up with a flashlight in their eyes, and bind them with shoelaces. He was meticulous. He would stack dishes on the husband's back and threaten that if he heard the dishes rattle, he would kill everyone in the house. He would eat their food. He would stay for hours. Then, the attacks moved south. In Santa Barbara and Orange County, a killer known as the original Night Stalker began bludgeoning couples to death in their beds. For decades, police departments were siloed. They didn't talk to each other. They didn't realize that the burglar in Visalia, the rapist in Sacramento, and the murderer in Galita were all the same man. He left behind a staggering trail of devastation. 30 murders, over 50 rapes, and more than 120 burglaries. But despite thousands of tips, massive task forces, and the best efforts of the FBI, he vanished. By 1986, the crime stopped. The Golden State Killer simply retired. He disappeared into the suburbs, leaving law enforcement with nothing but a cold trail and a few biological samples stored in freezers, waiting for a technology that hadn't been invented yet. Then, the attacks moved south. In Santa Barbara and Orange County, a killer known as the original Night Stalker began bludgeoning couples to death in their beds. For decades, police departments were siloed. They didn't talk to each other. They didn't realize that the burglar in Visalia, the rapist in Sacramento, and the murderer in Goleta were all the same man. He left behind a staggering trail of devastation. 13 murders, over 50 rapes, and more than 120 burglaries. But despite thousands of tips, massive task forces, and the best efforts of the FBI, he vanished. By 1986, the crime stopped. The Golden State Killer simply retired. He disappeared into the suburbs, leaving law enforcement with nothing but a cold trail and a few biological samples stored in freezers, waiting for a technology that hadn't been invented yet. By the late 1990s, the case was a relic. But one man couldn't let it go. Paul Holes, a toxicologist and investigator for the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office, became obsessed with the files. He spent his days digging through dusty boxes, looking for something the original detectives might have missed. In 2001, a breakthrough occurred. Advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to finally link the crimes. They proved that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. This was a massive revelation, but it was also a source of frustration. They now had a full DNA profile of the killer, a unique genetic fingerprint. But a DNA profile is useless if you don't have a name to match it to. They ran the killer's DNA through CODIS, the National Criminal Database. This database contains the DNA of convicted felons. The result? No match. This told them one crucial thing. The Golden State Killer had likely never been arrested for a felony. He was a clean skin. For the next 15 years, Paul Holes and other investigators tried everything. They looked at old lists of suspects. They looked at men who bought specific types of guns. They even looked at construction workers who might have worked on developments near the crime scenes. Every lead ended in a dead end. Paul Holes was nearing retirement. He knew that once he turned in his badge, the case might be boxed up forever. He needed a Hail Mary. By 2017, the world had changed. Millions of Americans were spitting into tubes and mailing their DNA to companies like Ancestry, Common23, and Me to learn about their heritage. These private companies built massive databases of genetic information. Paul Holes had a radical idea. He realized that he didn't need to find the killer's DNA in a database. He just needed to find a relative. If the killer had a third cousin who took a DNA test, that cousin would share a specific amount of genetic material with the killer. If they could find that cousin, they could build a family tree in reverse and hunt him down that way. However, law enforcement couldn't legally access the private databases of Ancestry or 23andMe without a warrant, and the courts were unlikely to grant one for a fishing expedition. But there was a loophole: GEDmatch. GEDmatch was a scrappy, open-source website where genealogy enthusiasts voluntarily uploaded their raw DNA data to find relatives across different platforms. It was a public square for genetic information. The users had opted in to share their data. In a move that would change the future of forensic science, Paul Holes created a fake profile using the Golden State Killer's crime scene DNA and uploaded it to GEDmatch. He wasn't looking for a suspect. He was looking for a family. The upload worked. The database spit out a list of matches, but there was no direct hit: no brother, no father, no son. The closest matches were distant cousins, people who shared only a tiny fraction of DNA with the killer. These were people who shared a great-grandparent with a monster and had no idea. Paul Holes teamed up with a genetic genealogist named Barbara Rae-Venter. Together, they embarked on the most complex logic puzzle in criminal history. They had to take these distant cousins and build their family trees back to the 1800s using census records, newspaper obituaries, and birth certificates. It was tedious, agonizing work. They were looking for a unification point, a marriage in the past that connected the disparate cousins. Once they found the common ancestors, the great-great-grandparents, they had to trace the lineage forward to the present day. They were looking for a needle in a haystack of thousands of descendants. They had to filter the list. They needed a male. He had to be born between 1945 and 1955, based on the killer's age estimation. He had to have lived in Sacramento in the 70s and Southern California in the 80s. They eliminated suspect after suspect. One branch of the family led to nothing. Another led to a man who was too young. Another led to a man who had died before the crime stopped. For 4 months, they pruned the tree, getting closer and closer to the trunk. In April 2018, the genealogy team hit the jackpot. All the branches of the tree pointed to one specific man. He was a 72-year-old retired truck mechanic living in Citrus Heights, a quiet suburb of Sacramento. He had lived in the area his entire life. His name was Joseph DeAngelo. When investigators ran his name through background checks, the pieces of the puzzle didn't just fit. They slammed into place with terrifying precision. DeAngelo had been a police officer during the exact years the East Area Rapist was active. This explained everything. It explained why the killer knew police response times. It explained how he knew how to check for fingerprints. It explained why he was so good at evasive driving. The Golden State Killer wasn't just evading the police. He was the police. Further digging revealed that DeAngelo had been fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting a hammer and dog repel in a burglary kit. The timeline matched perfectly. He moved from Exeter, Visalia ransacker, to Auburn, East Area Rapist, exactly when the crime shifted locations. The investigators knew they had their man, but a name on a family tree wasn't enough to arrest him. They needed physical proof. The Sacramento Sheriff's Department launched a massive covert surveillance operation. They couldn't risk tipping him off. If DeAngelo knew they were onto him, he might destroy evidence, kill himself, or flee. They needed his discarded DNA, something he threw away that contained his genetic material. For days, detectives sat in unmarked cars outside his beige, unremarkable house. They watched a man who had once terrorized an entire state doing mundane chores. He mowed the lawn. He worked on his motorcycle. He yelled at his neighbors. It was surreal. The monster was hiding in plain sight as a grumpy suburban retiree. They waited for trash day. But DeAngelo was careful. Perhaps his police training kicked in, or perhaps he was just paranoid. He didn't leave much behind. Finally, detectives were able to secure a tissue he dropped and a swab from a car door handle. They rushed the samples to the lab. The tension was unbearable. If the DNA didn't match, the entire genealogy theory was wrong. If it did match, they were about to arrest the most elusive serial killer in American history. The lab results came back. It was a perfect match. The DNA from the trash was identical to the DNA found at the murder scenes. The probability of it being anyone else was 1 in a quadrillion. On April 24, 2018, a tactical team surrounded DeAngelo's house in Citrus Heights. They waited until he stepped outside. He was working on his boat in the driveway, just like any other Tuesday. When the officers approached him, he looked up, stunned. This man who had been a phantom, a figure of pure athletic terror who could jump fences and outrun dogs, was now just a frail old man. He didn't fight. He didn't try to run. According to the arresting officers, his first words were incredibly mundane. "I have a roast in the oven." The banality of evil was on full display. The man who had bound, tortured, and murdered innocent people was worried about his dinner. As they handcuffed him, the decades-long nightmare of the Golden State Killer finally came to an end. The Visalia ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. They were all just Joe DeAngelo. Once in custody, DeAngelo's demeanor shifted drastically. In the interrogation room, he didn't act like the competent mechanic or the former cop. He acted like a man who had lost his mind. He slumped in his chair. He feigned catatonia. When detectives tried to question him, he began to mutter about an inner personality named Jerry. He whispered, I didn't have the strength to push him out. He made me. He went with me. It was like he was in my head. I mean, he's a part of me. I didn't want to do those things. Jerry made me do it. It was a chilling performance, but the detectives weren't buying it. They knew DeAngelo's history. Back in 1979, when he was caught shoplifting, he had faked a heart attack to try and get out of it. He was a manipulator. He was trying to set up an insanity defense, pretending that a split personality was responsible for the crimes. But the meticulous nature of his stalking, the planning, the escape routes, the cleanup proved that he was fully aware of his actions. Jerry didn't buy the rope and the ski masks. Joe did. Faced with insurmountable DNA evidence and a mountain of stolen property found in his home, Joseph DeAngelo realized there was no escape. To avoid the death penalty, he agreed to a plea deal. On June 29, 2020, the courtroom was packed not with a jury, but with survivors. In a university ballroom converted into a court of justice, DeAngelo pled guilty to 13 counts of murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. But the most powerful moment wasn't his plea. It was the victim impact statements. For days, survivors and family members stood up and faced the monster. They reclaimed the narrative. They spoke of decades of fear, of sleeping with guns under their pillows, of the trauma that never went away. But they also spoke of their resilience. One survivor looked at the frail, wheelchair-bound man and said, "The boogeyman is gone." Another said, "You are nothing." DeAngelo sat there, stone-faced, rarely making eye contact. His power was gone. He wasn't the Golden State Killer anymore. He was just a pathetic old man in a cage, forced to listen to the voices of the people he failed to destroy. Joseph DeAngelo was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. He will die in prison. But the legacy of this manhunt is far greater than the capture of one criminal. The Golden State Killer investigation changed policing forever. The technique spearheaded by Paul Holes and Barbara Rae-Venter investigative genetic genealogy cracked the code. It proved that public DNA databases could be used to solve the unsolvable. Since DeAngelo's arrest, hundreds of cold cases have been solved using this method. Murderers and rapists who thought they had gotten away with it, who had lived free for decades, are now looking over their shoulders. The message is clear. Science has caught up. You can change your name. You can move to a different state. You can retire and live a quiet life. But you cannot hide from your own DNA. The capture of the Golden State Killer proved that no case is ever truly closed. As long as there is evidence and as long as there are investigators willing to hunt, the truth will eventually come to light. Joseph DeAngelo thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted the police, the FBI, and time itself. But he forgot that while he was aging, science was evolving. He left a piece of himself at every crime scene, a biological calling card that would eventually ring 40 years later. The capture of the Golden State Killer didn't just solve a case. It ended an era. The age of the anonymous serial killer is over. You can burn the evidence. You can wear a mask, but you cannot change your own cells. But this victory comes with a question. To catch a monster, investigators had to access the genetic data of innocent people, his distant cousins who never asked to be involved. So, I want to hear from you. Do you think police should have unrestricted access to genealogy databases to solve cold cases? Or is genetic privacy a line we shouldn't cross? It's a debate that is changing laws right now. Let me know your stance in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the science of the manhunt, please hit the like button and subscribe. We have more cold cases to crack. Until next time, the truth is in your blood.